Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the panel on the monetary case for a job guarantee. Oh, sorry. Pull it over. So. Is that better? There we go. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the panel on the monetary case for the job guarantee. When we organized this panel, we knew it would be highly relevant for the conference, but I think that some of the comments that we've heard over the last day have really highlighted the importance of labor issues for the democratization of money, and I think that this panel can address some of the recurring themes that we've heard. We have four great panelists. We have Pavlina Tcherneva from Bard College, Rohan Gray from Cornell, where he's an SJD student. He's the founder and president of the Modern Money Network. Phil Harvey from Rutgers Law School, and Darrick Hamilton, who will be joining Ohio State at the start of the year, the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. After a long absence, the job guarantee and the human right to work have sort of returned to public debate, and our panelists have been working on this issue for years, and they're a big part of the reason why that's happened. There's a lot more I could say about all of them, but I'd like to get started. So just for format, each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So with that, we can get started.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Chris for the invitation and to Danny for organizing this panel. We are talking about the monetary case for job guarantee, so my remarks will be somewhat different from what you may have heard in the past. The main point that I'd like to make, well, I should first say for people who are new to the job guarantee that the job guarantee is simply a program that is a public option for work that is guaranteed by the federal government to all those who need it at decent pay, decent conditions. And so the monetary case for the job guarantee that I would like to make is that to be able to democratize money, we have to democratize work, that there is an inherent relationship between the two in the modern monetary system. In fact, I'd like to argue that the monetary system's original sin is that it creates unemployment, and that money is a public institution that is launched into existence by creating unemployment. And in this story, as I will say, as I will tell it, the taxes will play a crucial role. But what I like to highlight up front is that taxes are never really a financing operation for the government. They're always a resource transfer operation, even throughout historical time. They exist to provision the government in real goods and services. They are a tool of redistribution. So, okay. So what I would like to say is that the task before us is to fix this initial flaw in the monetary system. The job guarantee is one way to fixing this flaw, and also it has the potential to bring other democratizing tendencies in the labor market and other areas of social life. So my remarks are from a modern money perspective, from a chartalist perspective, and we see money as a creature of the state in the following sense. Yes, money is a debt, social credit-debt relationship. It's actually a power credit-debt relationship between creditors and debtors, but the state enters when the state codifies these debts. And when I say codifies, I mean that the state essentially determines how debts will be denominated between parties, how they will be, what will be delivered for repayment, how debts will be reinforced, and on top of that, the state imposes its own debts, obligatory debts on the population in the form of taxes, fees, and fines, and also declares how they will be paid and how they will be settled. And in this process, the state establishes the standard unit of account. This is, of course, historically contingent. So what is the purpose of the tax system? The purpose of the tax system is to induce someone to work and provide goods and services and labor in lieu of taxes. So the paper actually goes through some historical examples by looking at some of the history of time. I'm not going to go through these examples, but I will just say the following. Even if you look at the Mesopotamian palaces did not need clay tablets to spend. When you look at medieval England, the kings did not need wooden tally sticks in order to spend. The pharaohs of Egypt did not need debens in order to finance themselves, and in fact, they couldn't possibly tax debens from the population because those were virtual. Those were an abstract unit of account that will settle the tax obligation, but each of these central public institutions needed real resources. Labor to contain the Nile River floods, grain to feed the palace and the army, workers for the construction of quarries, canals, and roads, and the tax was the tool of compelling the citizenry to transfer some of these resources to the public domain. So this resource transfer is there to provision the authority itself, in part to also provision the community as a whole, to allow the central authority to redistribute some of this surplus to its subjects, in some cases, for the purposes of more equitable redistribution, in some cases for the enrichment of a small class of people. So what I'd like to highlight here is that, well, number one, there is an important relationship between taxes and unemployment that I'll explore in a moment in the modern context, but even through time, satisfying the tax obligation was done through delivering labor. And I want to spend a moment to talk about one of the most punitive forms of labor that was used to satisfy the tax, and that was called the corvée labor. The history of corvée labor illustrates that taxes were never there to finance the government. Corvée is basically unpaid mandatory labor for infrastructure project, or labor supplied in lieu of taxes imposed by public bodies on the population. Corvée labor was ubiquitous. It can be found in all societies of complex economic organization, from Mesopotamian palaces to ancient Egypt, from the early Chinese dynasties to Roman Empire, and was widespread in medieval and modern Europe. In the Incan Empire, roads were built using similar compulsory labor in lieu of taxes called mita. Corvée labor was temporary work on large-scale public projects that required large amount of labor. Now, it's no wonder then that when we think about public work, we very often associate public employment with the most punitive work and workfare arrangements that we have seen through historical time. But theoretically, corvée labor is important because it illustrates that the tax is the way to create the need to work to provision the public sector and to transfer the labor resource to the public sector. So if the if the state imposes taxes denominated in money, in state-administered unit of accounts, for the purposes of transferring these resources to the public sector, democratizing the monetary unit necessarily means democratizing the very process of distribution of those real resources between the private and the public sector. Okay, interesting little footnote here. If you study the jubilees, the history of jubilees, they were quite often done precisely for the reasons to cancel private sector debts so that people can be freed up from time working on the farm and generating grain and delivering it to private creditors in payment of taxes or in payment of their debts, in order to free that labor to then deliver some resources to the private sector or to perform labor for the public sector. So you can actually settle your taxes by just doing that work. So in the modern world, fast forward to the modern world, taxes and unemployment are intimately connected. Taxes are monetary in the modern world. They're not grain. We don't deliver grain to the state to settle our taxes. We don't deliver public works labor to settle our taxes. We deliver tokens. And so that obfuscates this relationship between state and subjects. They are payable in state-issued money, taxes today are payable in state-issued money, and state-issued money is a public monopoly. So modern nation states, just like their ancient counterparts, also impose compulsory debts on the population and determine how they will be settled. And now they have the exclusive monopoly power to issue the very thing, the currency that settles the tax obligation. So what that means is that, well, number one, Taxes cannot possibly be a financing operation for the government. Tax collections cannot possibly be revenue-raising function for the public sector that issues the very instrument that is used to satisfy the tax. In fact, you cannot collect more taxes in the form of currency than currency that has already been supplied in one way or another to the private sector. Okay. So the role of taxes is to create unemployment, to create demand for government-issued fiat currency, to create someone in search of the monetary instrument to satisfy the compulsory obligation to the state, but that somebody is being unable to do so unless and until the government provides it in adequate supply. So, okay. So, the tax obligation is satisfied when the individual is delivered to the state the very monetary instrument that it has issued, but to deliver it, you must work to get it. And so even in the modern sense, unemployment is a monetary phenomena via this relationship with the state. So in the first instance, taxes create an employment because someone needs seemingly useless currency to satisfy the tax. The private sector supplies real goods to the state to obtain the currency, and in this process provisions the state. But the existence of remaining unemployment means that the state, in turn, has not supplied the currency in adequate amount or in a manner that eliminates the very unemployment it has created through taxation. And so here comes the job guarantee. We have a flawed institutional design of the monetary system. It is, in a sense, incomplete. It's a system that has created money as a public good that can serve the public purpose, that transfers real resources from the private to the public domain. Those resources could be distributed in more democratic sense to the community as a whole, but in that process we have created unemployment that we have not then resolved. And so the job guarantee meets that challenge. The welfare state continues to need public school teachers, food inspectors, police force, other resources to fulfill its function. But then we face a paradox. We have not only not eliminated unemployment, but we have also under-provisioned the state because there's plenty of unsatisfied basic goods, basic public goods needs, rather. We don't provide for all needs. And so that paradox of under-provisioned state and of the existence of monetary unemployment can be resolved through the job guarantee, the modern, voluntary, open-ended Jobs for All program that employs the unemployed in good jobs is the democratic answer to corvée labor. The job guarantee program is the promise of fixing the original sin in the monetary system. And in my other work, I usually emphasize the other democratizing tendencies of the job guarantee. So I will conclude by just enumerating some of those. The job guarantee essentially provides for a very basic and fundamental human right. It is a public option for jobs that could establish a floor below which no working person will ever fall, both in the private or in the public sector. The program's living wage, program's wage is proposed to be a living wage, and then it would become the minimum wage for the economy as a whole, and the work performed will fulfill important needs gaps in the economy. And in the name of redistributive economic justice, the program would provide socially useful work, environmental stewardship, urban renewal and cleanup, the care of the young and the elderly, disabled or the elderly. And in an unstable macro market economy, the program would provide a humane macroeconomic stabilizer. While today's business cycles are stabilizing by expanding and shrinking a reserve army of labor, the job guarantee is the public option of work that will ensure that we have an army of employed people in decent, basic jobs that serve the public purpose. Thank you.
Please go. Okay, sweet. Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me. The only thing probably more fun than being on a panel about the job guarantee as a monetary phenomenon would be to be at a job guarantee conference talking about the monetary aspects of job guarantee. I should also mention that I, along with other co-panelists here, am a director of the National Jobs for All Network, formerly Jobs for All Coalition, who've been pushing the idea of a job guarantee on a range of different valencies, not just the sort of monetary angle for decades, and we welcome others to join if they're interested. So I just want to sort of contextualize and deepen some of the ways that Pavlina was framing this, coming from a legal background. But before I do, I want to start with a quote by post-Keynesian economist Paul Davidson, who says, "One wants to explain the empirical fact that involuntary unemployment is only associated with money-using contractual economies. In other words, real economies that do not use money and money-labor contracts to organize production, i.e. feudalism, slave economies, South Sea Islanders discovered by Margaret Mead, may possess important non-linearities or even an uncertain future, but there is never an important involuntary unemployment problem. Herds of animals, schools of fish, etc., organize together to solve the economic problems of what, how, for whom, without using money, contracts, or markets, yet these animals still face nonlinear problems in their search for food and interaction with other herds, yet animals never suffer from involuntary unemployment." So in that sense, I would like to define unemployment in a very basic, crude sense, which is the act of wanting to get money and being willing to do something for it, and then defining employment as getting paid to do something. We can add content to that, we can add quality, we can add desirability, we can add public purpose, but at a very crude, fundamental level, you know, you're sort of talking national income statistics. If you're getting paid to do something, those income statistics aren't asking how your quality of life is, they're saying, okay, you're employed for those purposes. And when we want to get into kind of Marxian analysis of who owns the means of production in this day and age, or in a monetary economy, what we mean by that is somebody who has enough money or available financing funds to pay you to do something, to hire you. You want to get paid to do something, you cannot pay yourself, they can, they become the capitalist in that context. So to complicate the MMT idea of taxes drive money, or to sort of deepen it, Pavlina was talking about taxes, fees, and fines, and I think it's important that we get beyond this, first of all, the idea that it's sort of a once-a-year income tax, or a wealth tax, or even a head tax, and to think what that concept means, what the broader category in which taxes, fees, fines, religious contributions, etc. fit into. And in that context, the way that I think we would define it is a non-reciprocal, hierarchically imposed obligation denominated in the unit of account. So that means that from that context, a criminal parking fine, like I got in Boston on Thursday, could be considered this, but so could getting sued by a private actor with the knowledge that the court is going to enforce that judgment against you. So could being required to pay for your water bill, because water isn't made a public free asset, and therefore if you want to live on this planet, you're going to have to pay whoever's managed to privatize the water supply. It could include having to pay for access to the king's lands after the enclosure movement meant that you couldn't sort of hunt pheasant or something like that. So I would describe the imposition of taxes from a lawyer's perspective as the imposition of some form of monetary liability. That could be a court-ordered judgment, and what that gets us into is a world where you may actually have a risk of incurring liability, even if you're not actually definitely going to incur that liability. And that makes this chartalist argument about taxation driving the value of money a lot softer and more comprehensive, because it's not simply about the knowledge that you have a tax bill at the end of the year of a certain amount and you don't have that much money. It's walking outside every single day with the knowledge that you're facing a legal risk of some degree of incurring a range of different liabilities of different degrees. So I could drive my car out of here and hit somebody and have to, hopefully it won't this time, and pay a lot of money. And the fact that every day I get in my car and I'm taking that risk means that I am living in a monetary economy, whether I like it or not, in the sense that I'm living in a monetary liability risk economy. And that is something that is a lot deeper than most people who try to come swinging at or critiquing chartalist narratives of taxes driving money really understand. They think about it in that very crude bilateral sense of a tax. They don't think of it in the sense of what it means to be living under the constant condition of incurring monetary liability risk. So that's the first thing that I think that we should think about as lawyers, and to sort of take this story and run with it. The second thing that's important to look at is what we mean by taxes generate unemployment. And so, first of all, it's important to recognize that, there are other sources of spending power and jobs in the economy. But as Pavlina said, the state as the issuer of the currency unit and the entity with the legal capacity to determine what it accepts in goods and service, in payment of taxes or other obligations, means that it's in a unique position relative to all those other actors, and those other actors may have not only different interests but different capacities to address that problem, which means if we need that problem to be solved as a moral issue or as a structural issue, we have to start with the entity actually capable of solving it. It doesn't matter whether we would like private capitalists to be primarily responsible for full employment. The point is they can't. And they can't at a structural level. Maybe they can for a while, maybe they want to even, but we cannot ensure a system that ensures everybody is fully employed with the resources necessary to do so unless we start with the entity that has the necessary ability. At the same time, we also need to think about the fact that unemployment there is not simply an objective fact. There is a value judgment going in what we mean by unemployment, because unemployment could be not just there's not enough people willing to work, but not enough jobs available to me, but not enough jobs I'm willing to take, or not enough jobs that are going to give me the kind of purchasing power to enact a minimum standard of living. If I think I need 12,000 kilojoules a day, and someone's willing to pay me, an income that's going to get me 5,000 kilojoules a day, they might think I'm employed, and I might think I'm unemployed. That isn't something that can be determined solely by reference to the fact that there was a wage being offered. It needs to look at actually the broader kind of economic conditions under which that wage is created and the price system. And that implicates that broader macroeconomic policy paradigm, which is why we need to think about things like price stability, purchasing power, and production, which I'll get into in a second. It also things like dignity and choice. If we think that slavery is a sufficient form of employment, you can sort of go to the sorry to bother you WeWork and sign up your entire life for a guarantee of employment. That might not be a sufficient answer to this problem either. And so we are baking in a set of value judgments to this narrative as well as technical judgments, but I think they're ones that are not particularly controversial, or at least controversial at a wide scale, even as there are going to be details we all need to hash out and have differences of opinion. I'm sure Phil's going to have some thoughts about that in a second. But it also comes to things like what we consider the limits to employment and that labour relation, because we obviously have boundaries to who we consider should be part of the labour market at all. We're not putting children in a condition of unemployment or people who cannot work. So obviously we're not talking about a theory of minimum living standards that is universal across everybody. But where it does come back in and where it is important is that the working class or labour is a source of production upon which other consumption depends. So to contrast, and I have sympathy for people who look at redistributive justice through things like redistributing capital income or capital dividends. I personally, would like to euthanize the capital class entirely, but even if you don't agree with that, it's a different thing to look at getting income off a plot of land while still assuming someone else is doing the farming work, and then looking at income from doing work itself. One of those has a monetary value directly connected to the labour system. The other has monetary value connected to a capital layer that is built on top of the labour system. And they have very different distributional dynamics, and they have very different dynamics in terms of how attempting to engage in redistributive policies through those different layers then affects the underlying production system. So one of the things that I think is really powerful about the job guarantee idea is that you can end up looking at the value of the money that comes through that system as a form of labour standard. So people like Keynes have talked about this. Even actually right-wingers, I forget who it was, I think it was someone at the American Enterprise Institute, talked about a job guarantee as open labour market operations to create a stable labour standard that they contrasted to gold. Now, of course, because it was a right-wing person, they said, well, we need to make sure that the market can create the jobs so that the value of work is still market determined. But they were recognizing this idea that if we can create a gold standard, we can create a labour standard. And if we're going to have something that's anchoring the value of our currency, I would say as a matter of justice, as a matter of smart production logic, it's better to do it with labour than it is with land in the sort of Palanian sense. If we're going to complicate all three of those fictitious commodities, labor, land, and money. I would say that money and labor have something more related to each other than land in a good sense, even if land is still the source of primary income that causes inequality today. So the only other thing about the job guarantee from a macroeconomic point of view, which is something else that MMT sort of harps a lot about, is that we're making a decision on this question already, implicitly. Right now, the central banks around the world have a thing called a NAIRU, where it's called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, where the idea is that if unemployment gets too low, it's going to start exerting price pressure on the economy, and therefore we need to raise that unemployment rate. Colleagues of mine at Fed Up and other activists have quite frankly, and I think brilliantly, put it as the Fed wants to keep you out of a job to balance the economy. And I think that we can point that out in a very stark moral way, because they're pretty open about this. It's called the NAIRU, it's in their technical models. This isn't some sort of Marxian plot. It's literally what they're saying is we need to keep a certain number of people unemployed because that's the only way we know how to deal with inflation. And Dan Tarullo, who is here, has written some great stuff about how the Fed doesn't actually have a working theory of inflation. So they don't know what inflation is or what causes it or how to fix it. But the one thing they do know is that the unemployed need to be suffering. That's the one thing we definitely need to keep a part of our current system. And so we would say that what thinking of a job guarantee from a monetary design angle does is it takes that variable off the table. I don't get to decide whether it would be better to reenact child slavery for inflationary reasons, because that's not an option in my moral, legal, political toolkit today. We need to be thinking about unemployment as a design failure, and a better designed economic system is one in which no matter what inflationary problems we face, the unemployed are not the first line of defense or the first line of sacrifice. And that's how thinking about a job guarantee as a core component of monetary design, rather than simply a moral or generally good economic idea, becomes a very fundamental and powerful argument. The last little thing I would say about the labour standard and where I see this in terms of practical politics is that this actually connects more broadly to thinking about moving beyond capitalist money, as we've been talking about at this conference. What does it mean to be in a democratic money? And I think the actually most interesting kind of place I've found in my research on this is from the Critique of the Goethe Program by Marx. And he talks about the transition from the current system, the current capitalist system, to communism as not one that can sort of start with some abstract ideal end goal, but has to start with the relations we're in. And he proposes a system of wage labor certificates, where you provide a certain amount of labor and you get a certificate, and that certificate functions like money. Which is, if you think about a job guarantee at $15 an hour, every 4 minutes of time you crank a thing and a dollar pops out. So if you want to have a labor certificate, this is actually what a job guarantee is doing within the narrow confines of the job guarantee. Obviously, there are other monetary dynamics going on. But one of the things that's interesting about that is that it gives us a theory of monetary production inherently tied to work and inherently tied to the productive capacity of labor that doesn't require property rights in land or the means of production more broadly. You don't need those rent-seeking or capital income assets to tell a coherent, entire, complete story of production and money. It's just not one that's based on capitalist money as we understand it today. And so if we're going to think about what democratizing money would be, I would say that this is a kind of very critical starting point for bridging the real economy and the monetary economy, and at the same time to think about what euthanizing the rentier and the capitalist class would look like. Thanks.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to start with this slide, which is a portrait of the U.S. labor market. The bottom line is a measure of the number of job openings, jobs that employers have that they are actively seeking workers to fill. And that time series begins in December of 2000, and hence my whole chart begins in December of 2000 because that was the first month in which that particular time series was reported by the BLS. So those are job openings. The red line is official unemployment in excess of job openings. So it includes all the jobs that are matched by, all the unemployed who are matched by a job opening, but adds to those people are not matched by a job opening. Above that are involuntary part-time workers who are people who have jobs, but they have part-time jobs, want full-time jobs. On average, they're about half unemployed. And then the top are job wanters not counted as unemployed because of the BLS's definition of official unemployment. And if we were able to take this chart back in time, we could do so 600 years, 700 years, and it would show exactly the same thing, though the terminology would be different. The term unemployment didn't become current until the beginning of the 20th century, and the current definition of official unemployment, which allows us to distinguish between the red line and the purple line, was not introduced until the end of the 1930s, the beginning of the 1940s. So the terminology would change. 600 years ago, unemployment was measured in terms of vagabondage by the able-bodied beggars, and highwaymen. But that's unemployment, okay? It's just called something different. The point is that the economy almost never has as many jobs as are needed to provide work for everybody who wants it. And we can see that that's a fluctuating gap during a recession, like our late current one. It's a huge gap because not only did the number, largely because of a decline in job openings, but the sizes of the other groups correspondingly increase. And then at the top of the business cycle, December of 2000, when the unemployment rate was 3.9% and had been under 4% for over 12 months, there still was a gap. And today, there still is a gap with unemployment not seasonally adjusted at 3.5%, 3.7% seasonally adjusted. Okay, so mathematically, if you have fewer jobs than unemployed people who want to work, there has to be unemployment. The job gap is, in legal terms, the proximate cause of unemployment. There may be other, causes back there, as we tell our first-year law students in explaining the concept of proximate cause from all the other causes that might factor into a consequence. Okay, but the proximate cause is a job gap. And now, next chart, another view of the labor market. Why is she crying? Well, she didn't get to sit down. Well, why didn't she get to sit down? Was it because she wasn't fast enough? Because she didn't try hard enough? Because a group of the kids, probably the boys, bullied her out of a seat? Okay. Was it because she didn't know the rules? No. The reason she's unemployed, the reason she's standing up is because there aren't enough chairs in the circle. However, if that circle was 150 million chairs with constant flux on and off, we might think, oh, gee whiz, we notice that the people who are standing around, they tend to be black. They tend to be, if we're conservative, lazy. They tend to be people without skills. They tend to be people, and from a progressive perspective, the emphasis will be on barriers to their participation on equal terms with other workers in the pursuit of chairs. Conservatives will say, well, it's their fault. They're just not trying hard enough. Okay. No. The reason they're not sitting down, the reason they're not employed is because there are not enough chairs. That's the proximate cause. Well, but what do we make then of all those other causes? The lack of training, employment discrimination, all of the factors that affect. Well, that's what determines who is unemployed. So that's the proximate cause of who suffers the unemployment. And not surprisingly, it's the people who are least advantaged in the community who end up standing. Now, their disadvantage may be one thing, it may be another. The unemployment rates amongst disabled unemployed workers are astronomical. We know the unemployment rates amongst blacks and other people of color are higher, always, than the unemployment rates of white, reflective of all of the forms in which racism and discrimination of various sorts operates in the economy. Okay, so it's an important factor, an important target of progressive policy. But would we be able to solve the problem of unemployment if we addressed all those problems? No. Would we be able to solve the problem of chairlessness if we taught every child who was chairless what they needed to know to get a seat the next time? No, because next time we ran the game, there'd still be a kid standing. Okay? And the kid would probably have a lot of the same characteristics as the earlier kid, disadvantaged in some way or another. Okay? So it's understandable that people looking at the labor market, where the number of chairs can't be counted, okay, or where they're not counted, and where the number of people who want to participate in work are not counted, people may be naturally led to believe, oh, it's all these individual characteristics and societal barriers that are the cause of unemployment. So we'll get rid of those, and the problem of unemployment will go away. And then programs are designed to address the problem of unemployment in that way, and lo and behold, even the ones that are successful, even the ones that have high placement rates, 6 months after the program, our graduates are employed. Have they done anything to reduce the total level of unemployment? No, because the job that their graduate got meant that someone else who would have gotten that job is now without a job, another candidate for their program. Okay? So in order to solve the problem of unemployment, we've got to close the job gap. That's the proximate cause of unemployment. And we probably can't address all of the other problems, which still would exist. Even if there were chairs for everybody, there'd still be plenty of opportunities for discrimination in who gets the better chairs and so forth. But without solving the problem of chairlessness, of unemployment by providing jobs, we're probably not going to be able to solve those other problems because there's too many ways that the more privileged can stay more privileged. Too many ways that they can up the ante if disadvantaged people are given a break. Okay, we'll do a little bit more or press a little bit harder back or whatever it takes to keep our privilege. Okay, so that a predicate for solving both kinds of problem, I think, are first closing the job gap. Now, when I first developed an interest in this problem, where am I at in minutes now? I forgot to start my timer. 7, okay. When I first began, it was actually in the aftermath of the 1981-83 double-dip recession. I had only become acquainted in 1980 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what for me was a kind of eye-opening notion that access to jobs and other economic needs and goods were viewed officially, formally, in international law as human rights, on a par with the right to freedom of speech and other things that are cherished in our Constitution. And so at the tail end of that recession, I had a sabbatical coming on. I said, well, gee whiz, I wonder what it would take to secure the right to work. What would it cost if all of the millions of unemployed workers as a result of that recession were instead offered jobs, paying decent wages during the course of the recession? This is a chart that reported the results of that research, updated and perfected over the next few years in a 1989 book. And the total cost, these are nominal from year-to-year terms, was almost $1.2 trillion. But, of course, the $1.2 trillion would have generated additional tax revenue because the wages paid to employ those people would be collected by the government. So that if you count what the income taxes they would pay, not tax collections in general, because the program would also have had a stimulative effect and lots of other people would have paid more taxes too, but just the taxes that the program participants would pay, payroll taxes and income taxes, came to 245, almost 250 billion. It's about 20% of the total cost of the program. Then another part of my research was, well, how much would the government save if all these people were employed rather than unemployed? Well, there'd be a whole bunch of benefits that would not have to be provided without even making any changes in eligibility requirements. Unemployment insurance benefits that would not be paid because the individual was employed. AFDC benefits because the individual was employed. Food stamp benefits that would be smaller or maybe non-existent because the individual would be employed. And so I tried to catalog, and this was really the hardest part of the research, all of the savings that all three levels of governments would enjoy as a result of putting all those folk to work, and the total came to $941 billion, which was about 60% of the, no, $941 was the net program cost after we take out the taxes that are paid. $724 billion. I thought that didn't sound like 80%. 60%. That's the 60%. So together, the tax revenue generated directly by the program and the savings generated directly by the program paid for 80% of it. Okay? And most of those savings were generated, if you look at the net figures down here, in the recession years, those two, 82, 83. In other words, my estimate here of the remaining budget that has to be paid, $217.8 billion, didn't take into account the anti-cyclical effect at all. Would the program have had an Sure. If the program were in place, then you would eliminate the characteristic of recessions whereby unemployment creates more unemployment. The unemployed worker stops buying, and then a business which otherwise is totally healthy loses trade and has to lay off workers. And so unemployment feeds on itself. Well, you're still going to have recessions. You're not going to prevent a housing bubble, but you may prevent it from spreading everywhere that is totally unassociated with the housing bubble. It also doesn't take into consideration any revenue that the program may generate by charging fees for or selling part of its output, most of which would be given away for free. But what if the output is childcare for everybody who wants it, but on a sliding scale? Or affordable housing, because that's in short supply. You're not going to give it away. You're going to give it away. You're going to provide it at affordable prices. So a program would generate income in some areas. Well, how big a figure is that? We only have to make up 20% of the budget, remember. Okay? And it doesn't take into account any indirect savings. Okay, we know that higher unemployment is associated with higher rates of criminal justice activity, particularly by youth. Okay, that's going to be reduced. We save money. We know that it affects mortality and morbidity rates. Okay, we're going to save money in health care expenditures. Okay? We know that it's associated with family dissolution. We're going to save money because families are going to tend to be more stable, and more families will be formed, which tend to be stable. Okay? So I have always believed, I started believing it then, that this isn't a free lunch. This is a lunch we've already paid for. Okay? We're already paying more for unemployment than it would cost to provide decent work for everyone who is unemployed. Okay? Now then, most recently, beginning about 7 years ago, how much time? 1 minute, okay. I started working on legislation with Representative John Conyers, designing a program that would provide decently paid work for everyone in the economy who didn't have it. This is the first version for March 2013. We revised it in 2015. In 2017, we did not revise it, not my choice. I submitted a bunch of revisions, but, well, truthfully, the staffer who was in charge convinced the Representative Conyers, no, let's not revise it this time around. The reason being that then he'd have to go around to about 40, 50 different offices to explain the changes to the co-sponsors before he could get them to sign on the line. And he looked at his calendar, no, let's just keep the bill unchanged. Now Representative Conyers is gone. The bill has been taken over by Representative Frederica Wilson, Florida representative of cowboy hat fame, knows how to be loud in a room, and we're hoping she's loud in the room in support of the bill. But I've submitted a bunch of revisions to her I don't know whether she'll buy them, but this is the table of contents of the new bill. I'm not going to explain anything. I'm just going to point out that the titles of the slides I would have used if I had the time. Why a trust fund, the sources of funding, most job creation projects created, administered, and who are the entities that can create the jobs, what are the conditions for obtaining grants to create jobs, why is there a link between wages and local public sector wages and benefits. What? You mean no $15 an hour minimum wage? That's right. I think progressives need to support the Fight for 15 campaign, but that doesn't mean that it makes sense to institute a $15 minimum wage via a job creation program as opposed to an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act, and this slide is going to explain why. If it's not going to have a $15 an hour minimum wage, how does the program guarantee living wage jobs? And there is, in fact, a developed strategy for that. And finally, how does the program provide a job guarantee? Because it's actually harder than you think. The Humphrey Hawkins bill of 1970s fame, widely praised because it had a justiciable right to a job, didn't really have a justiciable right to a job. It had a justiciable right to enrollment in a standby labor corps, which would provide you with a monthly stipend in exchange for which you had to remain available for assignment to local projects. If that had been proposed in the 80s, we might have called it generous workfare, maybe good workfare, but it's not a job guarantee. And that's it. Thank you. If anyone wants a copy of the revised bill and of an accompanying memo of explanation of the changes that I've proposed, I would be delighted to send it to you.
All right, so I'm going to present and try to go quick so we can have some audience participation. That's not an easy task for me. I first want to give thanks to other people who've worked on this. I'm presenting it, but they have put forth a lot of labor. That would be Alan Aha, Daniel Bustillo, Mark Paul, Ann Price, Kai Zah, Afranima Bial, William Darrick, Angela Glover Blackwell, and Sarah Truhaff. The private sector alone has never been adequate to deal with reinforcing inequalities and worker vulnerabilities. Even in economic expansion, inequality grows. Over the last 45 years, essentially all the gains of America's increasing productivity have gone to the elite, while real worker wages have remained roughly flat. Progressives often make economic productivity arguments to justify greater emphasis on equity. Such arguments may be valid, but they're context-specific, so they're not always valid. I prefer the Reverend Dr. William Barber's framing that economic justice is a moral imperative. With such an approach, economic inclusion becomes an explicit goal, regardless of context that we live. Basically, we need a societal shift away from public policy that prioritizes tax cuts for the rich and economic austerity for everyone else. Our current fiscal approach relies on tax incentives and deregulation to cajole and bribe our record profit-earning private sector to provide more jobs and build our nation's crumbling infrastructure. Such an approach further entrenches our plutocracy and leaves workers vulnerable to the whimsical nature of trickle-down employment and the instability of contingent work. Moreover, it represents a transfer of the value of our public infrastructure and assets to corporate interests with no guarantee that the infrastructure will actually be built in the first place. We need a shift from this neoliberal poverty governance type frame, which attempt to manage the seemingly bad behavior and work ethic of the poor and largely black and brown people. Instead, we need to emphasize and prioritize economic rights in which public provisions of services and opportunities are guaranteed to establish a baseline of resource. Policies like a federal job guarantee or publicly provided birthright to capital like baby bonds as viable public options to an often exploitive private sector. These policies, in contrast, would empower all people to be self-determining and shield vulnerable populations from the predatory for-profit nature of firms in which that profit motive, as well as distorted economic power, incentivizes them to extract and exploit rather than empower. The concept of economic rights is not new, nor is it radical. In 1944, President Roosevelt introduced the idea of an economic Bill of Rights. Roosevelt called for, quote, physical security, economic security, social security, and moral security. And the first article of this proposed second Bill of Rights was the guaranteed right to employment. Unfortunately, as Marshall pointed out earlier, since the Nixon administration, political sentiment regarding social mobility has radically shifted away from government mandates of economic security to a neoliberal approach where the market is presumed to be the solution for all our problems, whether they're economic or otherwise. As a result, the onus of social mobility has shifted to the individual. The pervasive narrative implicit in unfettered markets is that even if your lot in life is subpar, with perseverance and hard work and the virtues of the free market, you can turn your proverbial rags into riches. Markets, whether they're product markets, labor markets, financial markets, they're presumed to be natural, transparent, efficient, self-regulating, and inevitable. The most astute, the most valued, the hardest workers, they're believed to prosper and endure, while on the flip side, the virtues of the market will sanction those that are not astute, those that lack motivation, or are simply lazy. In other words, this is the deserving poor, and they're stigmatized by the political fodder of anti-blackness, whether they are actually black or not. The presumption is that they receive their just rewards and simply fade away or have to find something else to do over time. What is glaringly missing from this narrative is the role of power and the role of capital, and how power and capital can be used to alter the rules and structure of transactions in the first place. Power and capital are self-reinforcing, and without government intervention, they generate an iterative cycle of both stratification and inequality. Without capital, inequality becomes locked in. It is literally wealth that gives us choice, freedom, and optionality. And as was pointed out earlier, it is a political codification of that wealth that ensures its ability to ensure those things. Indeed, we need to prioritize economic rights, like the birthright to capital, like a federal job guarantee. These things promote economic inclusion, social equity, and they promote fairness as public options to predatory firms and the exclusionary benefits of inherited affluence altogether. Having Americans out of work does immense damage to the human spirit, and it imposes extensive costs to individuals, families, communities, and society as a whole. Yet the current political frame centers the problems of poverty and inequality and racial disparity on a deficiencies internal to the poor and blacks themselves. So what we're proposing is, rather than disciplining the poor, perhaps we need public alternatives that provide viable alternatives that in effect discipline bad acting private agents. The local implementation of the fight for 15 minimum wage is indicative of a break from the neoliberal norms, but it doesn't nearly go far enough. It still leaves many workers unemployed and out of the workforce altogether. It does not address the volatility of work hours and employment duration associated with increasingly precarious labor economy, nor does it address our 21st century physical and human infrastructure needs, or our increasing vulnerability to natural disaster resulting from an unnatural climate change, which all require substantial public investments. The Trump administration's jobs and infrastructure plan, as well as similar plans championed on both sides of the political aisle, it's used to provide tax incentives and deregulation, again, to try to incentivize the private sector to provide jobs and, again, to address our crumbling infrastructure. As I mentioned, it diverts public resources away from public assets towards producing the profits of private firms, again, with no guarantee the infrastructure gets built. Related are stimulus and job creation programs that offer time-limited assurance of a public subsidized job that may be administered through the for-profit or nonprofit sector after a worker has already demonstrated some waiting period while unemployed, sometimes 90 days of unemployment. These plans may be useful, but they're not transformative. They do little to enhance the bargaining power of those that are already employed. right? So a federal job guarantee not only gives people jobs, it empowers those that are employed by removing that threat of unemployment, so that a waitress who might be harassed at work through sexual harassment doesn't have to maintain that job in order to feed her family, but has a viable alternative. These job creation programs are designed to complement rather than compete with the private sector. As a result, the programs end up subsidizing low-wage, for-profit work, while in contrast, a federal job guarantee would raise the floor on wages, benefits, and working conditions by providing workers with viable, competitive alternatives to precarious work. Also, job creation programs that administer jobs by way of subsidy to nonprofits, they raise partisan political concerns regarding which nonprofits can and cannot receive funding. Also, they create the opportunity to usurp or misappropriate the mission of nonprofits by way of coercion with political funds for political purposes. Also, job creation programs that rely on match state funding, they will have the detrimental racial and class implications, since blacks and low-income Americans are overrepresented in states that collect less tax revenue and are more hostile to public programs. In contrast, a federal job guarantee would not be reliant on state funds and prioritize areas with the greatest employment needs, as well as the areas with the greatest human and physical infrastructure needs. In other words, they will provide regional balance as well, diverting resources to the areas that need them the most. Also, a job creation program with eligibility and termination requirements are susceptible to stigmatizing workers and to discriminatory implementation. In contrast, a federal job guarantee moves us away from the disciplining the poor frame to an economic rights frame, which serves to alleviate racial and gender stigma as well as discrimination associated with public programs. Our plan of a federal job guarantee would provide a direct source of employment and enable all workers, particularly those at the low end of the labor market, to bargain for better wages, benefits, without the fear and of destitution from the threat of unemployment. Like a tenured professor, I don't have that threat of unemployment. Let's let every worker not have that. It is not an employer of last resort, but a viable alternative to undesirable low pay, low benefits, and poor working conditions. It would structurally change the U.S. economy away from low-wage work towards more moderate and high-wage labor, a sector in which the expanding global economy is making the U.S. increasingly less competitive towards more moderate and high-wage jobs. Moreover, it would provide the best buffer against employment transition due to automation and technology change. To be clear, we're not talking about workfare. We're not talking about requirements as mechanisms to discipline the poor. Rather, we're talking about empowering workers with an authentic right to work for decent wages on a productive job to enhance our public, physical, and human infrastructure. In order to deliver these jobs, the federal government, states, Indian nations, local municipalities, they would conduct inventories of their needs and develop job banks and tasks to be performed. Pavlina has talked a lot about employment centers as in contrast to unemployment centers. I think that's a well use of the term and would be appropriate. So we could use employment centers to prioritize what projects would have the most urgent needs in the most distressed communities. The work done would address our nation's 21st century infrastructure needs. The jobs could range from construction, education, health services, supportive housing, libraries, elder care, arts, culture, projects designed to transform cities to green, emission-free municipalities that are more sustainable as well as resilient. Provisions for human infrastructure investments would include high-quality universal pre-kindergarten education, child care, adult care, elder care. Some care workers would be trained to deliver special needs. The current cost of child care is a major obstacle for many parents, restricting their access to the labor market and greatly exacerbating inequality and access of opportunity for their children. While our proposal is facially gender neutral, it is gender conscious, since basic elements could disproportionately benefit women who disproportionately carry greater care obligations. The work would include disability-centered advocacy to facilitate more long-term solutions toward dignified employment, livability, financial independence. Since the program could be designed to emphasize employment transition, the formerly incarcerated would be included as well. So I'm going to skip around in the interest of time and say a couple of things and then conclude. The moral hazard problem associated with the implicit promise of a bailout for the financial sector in times of economic crisis, that would dramatically be curtailed. Let them act like cowboys on Wall Street, if indeed we have a federal job guarantee in place, as well as other economic rights to ensure that Main Street won't suffer. Basically, the federal job guarantee would buffer the economic well-being of Main Street from the risky so-called too big to fail work that might be taking place on Wall Street. In addition, the federal job guarantee program would mitigate the personal and familial costs of damaged mental health and other stressors faced by the unemployed. The unemployed themselves often say they would rather be paid to work rather than receive unemployment compensation. Dignity is multifaceted, and one's dignity is not limited by work, but everyone should have the right to work with dignity of at least decent wages, benefits, and working conditions. Not only would a federal job guarantee restore the psychological balance to millions of unemployed and underemployed individuals who desire to work but cannot, it would also address the long-standing unjust and discriminatory barriers that keep large segments of stigmatized populations out of the labor force and reverse the rising tide of inequality for all workers by strengthening their labor market bargaining position and ultimately eliminating the threat of unemployment for all. Thank you.
Is this on? Okay. All right. I think we'll just take questions from the audience to start. Let's take 3 at a time.
Thank you. I love this idea. Darrick, some of your remarks suggested that perhaps this isn't aiming high enough, though. You said that you found that people would rather contribute to society in some useful and meaningful way rather than just get some money. If that's true, then wouldn't it make more sense, wouldn't it be more straightforward just to give everybody a basic income and trust that people will contribute in a way that is useful and also at the same time take care of all the people who are for some reason not able to work, such as mentally ill or children, elders. I'd like to hear what you all think of that at some point.
Okay.
My question is for all the panelists, and it's about how we sort of push back against the dominant assumptions about a low unemployment economy right now. I'm in business school, and I can't get anyone to talk about unemployment because it's just so ingrained in how sort of the media treats this. And I think in the Obama years, sort of even Democrats were sort of reluctant to sort of speak honestly about this because it sort of poked holes in the recovery. And just curious how, given that it is sort of the assumption that it's a low employment economy, how we really generate demand and interest in this idea.
Hello. My question is, first is a comment on the idea of like workers' compensation, and also the payment. The idea that their marginal production is would be equal to the revenue of the marginal revenue that they're producing for the industry that they're working at. And what you see is as unions are suppressed due to the changes you guys talked about neoliberalism, the idea that the market will figure it out, the larger the gap is between competition and also the productivity. I mean, there's been I think some of you mentioned that there's been a rise of the United States, for example, the productivity has gone up, and what you see is the competition is actually going down. And my question is, doesn't the large pool of unemployed, doesn't it sort of foster this philosophy of neoliberalism in the sense that the larger the unemployed are, the more power industries have, in the sense of like having more coercive power they have, because those with jobs have to endure the terrible conditions they're working, whether it be wage or the condition under which they work, so that they don't get fired due to the massive unemployment level.
Let's get responses to those and we'll take some more questions.
You want me to lead? Okay. So the first question about basic income, I'm not philosophically opposed to basic income. Most of my concerns are practical. The point that I was making about people desiring to work, not everybody wants to be entrepreneurial. I mean, many people like the social setting of a workplace. My practical concerns with basic income is the cost that it would take to lift people out of poverty, the fact that it's not generating the infrastructure investments, and that if, in the way many people design it as literally the same income across the entire population, that will have inequality enhancing aspects that the tax code would be an inefficient approach to address, which is often the rebuttal. But ultimately, we need a package of economic goods, so cannibalizing them as choices is not the right way to go, in my opinion. And if we're serious about a basic income, to me, we need to think about some of those practical things that have been raised. People like Kamala Harris's in her bill, where she's talking about using the tax code as a redistributive manner in a more progressive way. She doesn't use this terminology, but basically a negative income tax. That I'm supportive of thinking like that. And again, all this needs to be designed in a package of goods. Job guarantee doesn't solve all of the economic problems, but it solves a lot of the major ones. The other question was, I'd say that the other point that was raised, ultimately we need to push back on these narratives that exist. And the earlier talk before us made this case as well. It has become a dogma that market rhetoric is reality without any pushback. And that's where we're losing the battle to begin with. So the problems are often more political than they are economic. I think we have solutions, but we need to push back on these narratives which are problematic. And one of the two biggest critiques of federal job guarantee are, one, the cost involved, and thank God for the modern monetary theory networks that are providing us with narratives and explanation about how the government actually does pay for things, and thank God for Phil for presenting his work and talking about the ways in which our costs would go down. The real opportunity cost is what we're currently spending towards poverty expenses, and it's really aimed at subsistence, not really development to maintain the poor, maintain this surplus population rather than social mobility. So there's some good knowledge is being produced already in that area. But the other critique is usually efficiency loss, and that was related to your question: is are we distorting resources from their most productive use with this federal intervention? And this relates to the second point I was trying to make, which is that dogma of the market that goes unchallenged to begin with. Look around. Are we allocating resources in an efficient way when we're about to destroy the planet? Right? I mean, we can look around and walk and see, are there so many things in our lives that are not being produced that obviously would benefit us and lead to a better society if they were being produced? And the answer is yes. But aside from all of that, which I think we shouldn't concede the efficiency arguments of what a public sector can do in response to what a private sector is certainly not doing. To me, the most compelling reason is the rights frame. We should do it because it's the right thing to do, because nobody should be left without the dignity of access to employment. We should do it because the goods and services produced by a federal job guarantee are necessary for us to have an inclusive, equity, civically engaged society.
I agree with everything that Darrick said, and I'll just add a couple of points. One further point on basic income is that another problem with it is that it doesn't, in fact, provide an adequate substitute for securing the right to work. If you've got two people, they've both got a basic income, and then they've got a wage because they've also got a job. One is unemployed, loses the wage, still has the basic income. The basic income doesn't compensate for what they've lost a bit. Okay? So that a human rights framework insists that everyone has a right to a decent standard of living, including a decent income. But that doesn't mean that a basic income guarantee is the best way to get there. And I think that the combination of a job guarantee, which actually would have the beneficial political effect of defanging a lot of the discussion about providing benefits to other population groups, because the fear is always, oh, we're going to provide a benefit for someone who should be working. Well, we're providing jobs for everybody who wants to work, and it makes it easier then to justify more generous benefits for kids, people with disabilities, the elderly, and other groups that are less controversial recipients of aid.
Yeah, so on the first point with universal basic income, I think it's really important to, first of all, everybody has a right to a universal basic standard of living. I think that's something that we should all commit to, but the question then becomes, is the best way to do that by handing everybody a check and assuming they should consume that through the cash nexus and all the problems with that, or providing those services directly or other ways? That's the first thing. The second thing is a basic income doesn't have an internal theory of production. It's money goes into a thing over there called the market, and then the real goods and services come out the other side you get to consume. There isn't a thing called the market that's doing production. That is some fiction that we've isolated out of the broader economic system and the social system. So we need to actually own the fact that if we want our universal basic income, we want capitalism to solve the problems of production, and with all the problems that we recognize of the current system will just be exacerbated. I don't think that liberation from the economy comes by topping up people's Amazon accounts, and that's what I think a universal basic income has the risk of doing when it's not accompanied with a theory of underlying production. The more broader question or point, I think, that building on what Darrick and Phil were just saying, is a job guarantee is a deeper commitment than just a consumption commitment. It's a commitment to your role as a valued member of the human race and your community, and a commitment by the public to give you the means to self-actualize. I could have all the basic income in the world, and that doesn't make me a lawyer, and it doesn't make me an architect unless there's means for me to get access to those experiences and those licenses and those communities of work. I could be the most amazing artist in the world, and if nobody cares about me because I don't have access to distribution systems, it doesn't matter whether finally being free of my 9-to-5 grind is going to cause me to suddenly become the artist I want to be. And if you tell a child, what do you want to do when you're 5? Most of them don't say, receive a check. They say, I want to be an astronaut, or I want to be a firefighter, or I want to be an artist, or I want to be a teacher. That is the commitment that a job guarantee is saying is, okay, we'll work with you on that stuff. Maybe you'll find it's unrealistic and you'll change career paths or whatever, but there is an end goal called you are part of something. And there's some amazing work, I'm forgetting the name of the author right now, but it just recently came out a whole history book about the history of disability as a category, and how for a lot of up till the mid-19th century, there wasn't a hard line between the disability community and everybody else. The disabled people were expected to work and contribute to the community as much as they were able to alongside everybody else. And the creation of that category became a way to stigmatize and reduce the commitment to that community to be part of that broader social productive process. And I think that's the deep injustice, or the sort of soft bigotry of low expectations, that comparing a basic income to a job guarantee leads us to, in terms of the vision that we're promising to children. Really quickly, the low employment thing, I think there is an imaginative break we need to get to, that this is the start of something bigger. So a job guarantee is a way to start a conversation of, we can create public jobs, right? If we think that things need to be done in our community, we should have a way to do that, even if we're not already rich or already have access to bank financing or something. And this is the first time, I think, that we are imaginatively allowing ourselves again to talk about direct public sector job creation. And we're starting at the bottom because that's the most morally defensible place. But there's no reason why that doesn't open up a whole new door to, we can start talking about what jobs we want in our community that aren't just police and judges and firefighters and the military, which is the sort of negotiated social kind of compromise we're at now. Lastly, with the worker bargaining power, I think that, I totally agree with productivity, and if we have a job guarantee, we have a very different conception of what unionization potential looks like. Everybody's part of the job guarantee union. It's an alternative to a strike fund because it's actually a strike production system. You not only have a right to go on strike from your current employer, you have a right to go to a farm and actually make food so that your family isn't relying on the food that your employer was going to sell you or whatever else it is. So every time there's a crisis or there's a massive strike or capital labor relations get problematic, that's a place for the job guarantee to ratchet up. And that could be a permanent thing or a temporary thing depending on what your politics are.
All right, so I agree with pretty much everything that was said so far. Even the successful income guarantee experiments show that people still need work. And so the only way that we could provide it to all is by guaranteeing it. There are, in fact, really interesting experiments. I've looked at one in Argentina where people were asked to transition from a jobs guarantee program to an income support program, and people didn't really want to transition because of all these other benefits that work provides to them, even though the basic income program provided more income than the job guarantee program. But I do, maybe that's the only thing that I disagree with, maybe with Darrick here, and probably the only thing is that I do have a philosophical opposition to the universal basic income provided to all, irrespective of whatever labor market participation, to provide the basic decent life. Because I think it's a false promise, and it is predicated on this notion that, well, it actually doesn't recognize that we work to provision for ourselves. That, we need to really broaden the vision and the idea of work. Basic income kind of responds to the punitive forms of work that we see in modern society. But throughout time, we have had to provision for ourselves, and we have to provision for ourselves collectively. So if my story is correct, if the tax system is this coercive mechanism that is transferring real resources from the private to the public sector to then potentially redistribute them more equitably, that's one mechanism by which we've been doing this, and we've been doing it in a very flawed way. We create unemployment, we have not been able to solve it, we have not provisioned the public sector. If you provide basic income, you under-provision the public sector, because people don't have to work for the currency. They get, in a sense, free money, right? Why would you work for it? So it is we're trying to democratize this inherently, coercive relationship at the heart of the monetary system. And so that's really my philosophy, that, we need to rethink what it means to work and to establish a coordinating mechanism of public goods provisioning. Provisioning for families and individuals through jobs and dignified jobs, but also to the public sector to provide public services. So I'll leave it there. On the pushback, strategies for pushback, it really is a hurdle. But there are several things to say. First, I've started talking a lot about the real costs that Phil was mentioning, the social costs. They are countless. Just look at the public, health literature, the cognitive sciences. These are really enormous costs to society. So even a little bit of unemployment is paid in these real terms, and if only people were to understand the neglect that children experience because parents have no access to decent employment, the mental, physical problems that they and their spouses experience, the loss of human capital, you name it. It's a long list. So if we just pivot into tell that story, then people understand that we're already bearing these real costs, and there's just a better way. And then the other thing is a strategy point. I say do it now, because it's easy. When unemployment is low, because the next recession is coming. We know exactly how unemployment behaves and how it spreads like a contagion effect through communities. So you need to have a standby policy of prevention to stop this avalanche effect. And, the moral claim is extremely important. Why? The Fed is so clear about it. We are seeing wage pressures, which means that you're earning too much income. We have to step on the brakes. In which moral framework is this an acceptable policy response to prices? The job guarantee has price stabilizing features. And then the final thing is that this is, as a preventative measure, this is the policy that's going to deal with the frontline fallout from climate threats and climate change, because we know exactly who's going to suffer. You have a hurricane in Puerto Rico, and it wipes out all businesses, all means of subsistence, and people die. And so you need to have some sort of direct response to provide them not just with the job, with the means of subsistence and the public good services that they will so need. And finally, on the productivity question, we have good research. People that are poorly paid and that are afraid of losing jobs are bad workers. They're not happy. But if they have some sort of security, they do better. And so the response to this question is unemployment has zero productivity, even not negative productivity. Yes.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left. I saw, I think, a couple hands over here, and then I'm going to hop over to the other side of the room just to get as many on the record as we can. I don't think I'm going to be able to get to everybody.
So on the climate change, actually, I'm glad you guys brought it up, because that's actually my favorite thing about the jobs guarantee. So I would say two reasons why, and then a request to maybe measure this, or if you have measured it. So one is that you have depegged, so you can measure productivity by labor, goods, or land, and you're taking labor, which is the most environmentally, and then depegging labor from work that is like production, right? So male to female, or call it what you want, maybe that's sexist, but like you're adding care work as the meaning of work, and those two things are absolutely essential if we're gonna stop measuring GDP by what kind of goods and land we basically exploit. And so I'm wondering, Philip, if there's a way to measure that and add that to the cost, right? So if we can gear jobs toward care work and just recycle, with our own labor, that we can save so much in our carbon output.
You have to run, correct? So do you want to respond to that now?
I have to leave at 4 to catch a plane.
Yeah, so do you want to respond to that? Direct it to you now. Oh, yeah.
Phil, I was interested in you explaining your decent wage. You had a slide out there, and you said we didn't have quite have time. I want to give you a minute to get to that slide. Or how do you come up with a wage for people?
The right to work is an individual right. That means that everyone as an individual has a right to a decent wage, not a hypothetical worker. So that what's needed is a variety of strategies that, one, yes, make available, and one other thing, and it also expressly recognizes the need for social supplementation. There are people with big families. There are people with special needs. They need more, and you need social supplements to meet that. So then, what's the strategy in HR 1000? Well, one, you make sure that all program employees are getting whatever social supplements they're eligible for. So one of the conditions of receiving a program grant is that they provide affirmative assistance to all of their employees to apply for and maintain eligibility for whatever benefits they're available. In fact, I think that'd be a great project for some group to do for everyone. Secondly, the program itself increases the availability of social supplements by providing child care at low or free cost, affordable housing, et cetera. Third, though, but the backup is anybody who does not have the qualifications to be qualified for a job that allows them to earn a decent wage given the local cost of living, their family circumstances, special needs in the family, they're entitled on a priority basis to as much additional training as is necessary to qualify for a job that does pay enough. And if that's difficult to achieve for whatever reason, then the program itself provides the additional supplementation necessary to get it. So rather than promising a basic wage that quote unquote is a living wage, which I don't think really is true in human rights terms, you promise every individual enrolled in the program that they are going to walk out the door with a living wage individually.
Can we just get and then we can go till 4:05, I think.
The other, before I go, the other question, I am intrigued by that. I have not thought about it, but I am going to start talking about it, and I'll get in touch with you so that we can figure it out, because it's an issue that's got a history. The wages for housework, et cetera, et cetera, and yeah, I'd like to work on that.
Hey, so I'm really curious about this question of how do we reimagine work. I'm curious to hear more about resources and places where people are doing that. I heard my friend told me a story about how he went to Thailand, and there's literally monks who don't work at all. Literally, they're just their work, their service to the world is they pray and they do other things. So I'm wondering, how is it? I guess another question is, are there people that are actually like unemployable? Do you believe in that? Is that really even a thing? And how many of those people are there? Because that might be an issue.
Hello. In regards to what you were talking about, Dr. Hamilton, can you still make a case for reparations for African Americans even with the job guarantee? Because I understand that my people built this country with free labor, and to have this equality thing, I'm just afraid of us not getting our due. So that's it.
This is the last time I go first.
I'll go first. I'm happy to go
I'll go. I was making a joke. So the role of government reimagining work, some might argue that monk is actually working, and the notion of whether there's a such thing as unemployable, maybe somebody that's in indigent care and in intensive care, but the reality is that would have to be really particular, and in general, most people are employable in some domain. And again, repeating the narrative that my friend Pavlina has mentioned, it is the role of the state to engage in activities to find where that activity could take place. So I reject the concept of unemployable, and oftentimes is used as a ruse directed at certain populations who are often black, as a mechanism to discipline this group and put the onus on them. Let me get to the question of reparations. I fully support reparations, and I think that, again, if I were to list a Bill of Economic Rights from my frame, we talked a lot about public banking. We talked in this conference about federalizing credit scores. I talk a lot about a birthright to capital in a capitalist system. We could talk about a right to education, a right to health care, and this is more of a human right, not an economic right, but a right to engage in life without the threat of police locking you up for your race and restricting your mobility, or what's even worse, that threat that they might lock you up. So I'm going to go on a little tangent and say, right now there's this rhetoric around whether police are more likely to kill a black person than a white person. And usually those people that argue, well, surprisingly, no. It's the denominator that they use. They try to do what I might call a sleight of hand, of saying that the real denominator is not share of police shootings as a result of share of the population, but share of police shootings as a result of the share of engagement with the police. Now, we know that engagement with the police is endogenous to begin with. It's not random. But nonetheless, what's missing from all of that is historically and presently, the impact of the threat of what the state can do to you as a black person, that in and of alone is oppressive. And it doesn't get measured when we look at the actual encounters. And, it was related to that talk that was given earlier. So there is a case for reparations for black people because of the injustice that took place. And of all those Bill of Rights that I talked about, none of them were race-specific except for reparations. And I full-heartedly support reparations because it is a parsimonious approach to address some of the inequality. But also, again, in this notion of right, if we are to get beyond the race problem in America, we need to come with a reckoning of the harms that were committed. And the impact of this is not just for black people. The benefit for white people, now certainly there is a notion of white privilege where there are material and psychological benefits that accrue to white people. So, let's not mislead ourselves in thinking that a racial coalition is the best thing for everyone. It may be, but this is another one of those things where morality becomes a more compelling reason than economic reason. Because that notion that collectively we can compete against the capitalist class, then we all would be better. What's missing from that is the role of privilege itself that accrues to white people. White people would have to literally give up the benefit of being twice as likely to be employed in a recession compared to a black person if we were to have true racial coalition. So that's a serious benefit. And from an individual's perspective, one might not want to give it up. But back to reparations. With reparations, we need three things. One is acknowledgement, an authentic acknowledgement of what happened and why we are so unequal today, redress for what happened, and then we can move along as a country in harmony. Black people would have to give up their claims to reparations if it's properly dealt with, because we would have dealt with the race problem. So the acknowledgement part, where we truly acknowledge where we are and why we have unequalness today in society, the benefit that would accrue to white people is these narratives in which we address poverty to begin with. We niggerize poor people, whether they're black or not. If we were to truly reconcile with reparations and deal with the acknowledgement part, we would be less able to niggerize poor people in general, because we would have a true reckoning of why inequality exists, and it results from a deprivation of resources to begin with, not some collective action amongst black people or poor people that leads to their condition.
I'll be quick. On the single wage question, or the wage setting question, I think there are benefits, both strategically, conceptually, to thinking about a single base wage. First of all, because it universalizes the program. Second of all, because it universalizes the idea of labor time as something we all contribute in an equal way. We've only got so many breaths on this planet. They're equally valuable to each of us. I think it's possible to combine that with having premiums for skills, recognized qualifications, things like that, as well as additional premiums for particular contextual needs for an individual based on geography, etc. I think there is still value to talking about the single wage as the starting point conceptually, even if you have some tiered system or some system that adds premiums on top of that single wage. And I think that connects into the MMT paradigm for macroeconomic stability and the role the job guarantee plays. And I personally am more in favor of talking more about tiers than some of that research does, and I respectfully, depart from some of my MMT colleagues on that point, but I don't think it's inconsistent with MMT, and I wouldn't be saying that stuff if I thought it was inconsistent, because I think that macroeconomic stability aspect is really critical, and the way of thinking about labor time as a common standard across skills, etc., is also a really critical egalitarian aspect of what a job guarantee is doing. It's important that 4 minutes of your time is worth 4 minutes of my time, even if then I get a 50% bump because I've got a medical license or something. It's still that basic idea is still a really important part. The other thing about reimagining work, on Mercer's question, I always joke about a massage economy. You can do it with poetry or whatever. There's a whole range of things that cost no real resources beyond the breathing that we're already doing, coral economy or something, right? But it's tautological now that if something is a job that's worth doing, it's worth doing because it's profitable, and that might be incredibly extractive and all those other things that we know. So I think that the idea of value as a socially determined category is completely fair, and there are different ways to think of value. So I think one way is, for example, participatory budgeting. We've got colleagues who've been working on combining that with a version of a job guarantee. Jonathan Kroc, who's here, has talked about having a citizens' assembly, so a sort of independent body that thinks about jobs to represent the needs of particular communities. I understand and respect Darrick's concerns about the non-profit sector. I think that it's possible to use some sort of institution where, if you are meeting the standards, whether it's sort of charitable purpose or something, and maybe we need to be more or less restrictive about what that constitutes. I don't know if I would fight to not have a gun range as a job guarantee, even though I personally abhor that and wouldn't want it. But if that's the compromise to get middle America, to think that this is the kind of things for my community, or cleaning churches or something, maybe that is a sufficiently wide spectrum of work that we should be acknowledging in public interest in devising institutional channels to allow that to happen. And the last question about unemployable, I was a preschool and early childhood teacher, and I don't think any child is uneducatable. I don't think any person has no worth. And I think the question of when we give up on someone is really a question about ourselves, not a question about them. And when it comes to even people who are difficult behaviorally or socially, even people who are difficult in bad ways, harassing to other people and things, in K-12 education, you don't get the right to blame the kid. You have to take responsibility for dealing with it. So we have a system of special education based around a standard called least restrictive means, which means you put a child in a context where they can still get their right to learn in a way that is least restrictive to them, but also not harmful to anybody else. And I think we can think of similar standards like that for people who are difficult to employ or have special employability needs without pathologizing them and without assuming that there's some endpoint where we say it's okay to give up.
Yeah, I totally agree on the unemployable question, so I won't address that. I did want to say something on Mercer's question on how we measure value. And I think the care concept is truly central, I think, in the way we re-envision the world. Because as a practical reality, the vast majority of work that we do is actually care work. It is the work to reproduce ourselves and our families. We educate ourselves, we feed ourselves, we entertain ourselves. Manufacturing is a very small part of the economy, and it never was more than 50% of the economy anyway. So when we think about these things, it is important that this is meaningful, well-paid, decent work, and we can do what we did for manufacturing. That was pretty awful type of work at the turn of the century, and then all of a sudden we paid good wages and we unionized it. It became desirable, and it was a status symbol. And so there's no reason why we cannot do the same for care work. And GDP just measures, the exchange of that value, essentially. Right now, we measure jailing people, incarcerating people, and spending money on prisons. We could be spending that money on creating, socially useful output. And so it's just what gets fed into the GDP measure. So I actually literally talk about it in those terms: a national care act, care for the environment, care for communities, care for people.
All right, I think we're unfortunately out of time, already 10 minutes over, so please join me in thanking the panel.